I texted him, please let me go, and blocked his number. 3 weeks later, he crossed an ocean carrying a 70-year-old diving helmet he'd polished himself. Cora Ashby had been on the platform for 19 days of a 28-day rotation when the gale hit, and by 10 at night, the wind had gotten loud enough that the whole rig seemed to groan every time a swell rolled through, steel flexing against steel somewhere deep in the ballast tanks below her boots. She was 31 years old, an offshore dive systems and subsea monitoring technician who spent her rotations tracking seismic sensor arrays, dive support telemetry, and deep-sea pressure data off 6 monitors in a control room that smelled permanently of scorched coffee and hot electronics. And she'd taken this job 3 years ago for one reason only. Her father's boat, the Mary Ellen, had gone down off the Grand Banks in a squall that nobody saw coming until it was already on top of them. And the insurance payout hadn't come close to covering what was still owed on the vessel. And because Cora had co-signed the note when the bank wouldn't approve her father a loan, the 6 figures of difference landed on her, so she'd gone offshore to pay it down faster than a shore job ever could. The platform itself sat about 110 miles off the Scottish coast, a semi-submersible the size of a small town, all catwalks and cable trays and floodlights that never fully went dark even at 2 in the morning. And after 3 years, Cora had learned every groan and clank it made well enough to know within a second or two whether a sound coming through the deck plates meant something was actually wrong, or whether it was just the platform doing what platforms did in weather like this. She wasn't the type to make friends easily on rotation, kept her head down in the mess hall, ate fast, worked longer hours than the schedule technically required, and most of the crew had stopped trying to draw her into conversation somewhere around her second hitch, which suited her fine because talking to people always seemed to lead somewhere she'd rather not go. The cook, a heavy-set guy named Dwayne who'd been offshore longer than Cora had been alive, still saved her a plate on the nights she worked through dinner, sliding it across the pass-through window without a word. And that was about as close to friendship as she let anybody get out here. Her shift that night had started at 6 in the evening, running diagnostics on the seismic array, feeding data up from the seabed, cross-checking pressure telemetry against 3 redundant systems because a bad reading 300 feet down could mean anything from a sensor fault to a wellhead problem nobody wanted to discover the hard way. The mandatory exterior audit was supposed to come at shift end, but Cora had started running it at the 4-hour mark ever since a failed sensor cable 3 months back had taught her not to wait. Walking the wet deck with a tablet and a headlamp, checking sensor cable jacketing for corrosion and wear, junction boxes for water intrusion, strain reliefs for cracking, and she'd never once skipped a rotation of it, even in weather like this, because a cable that failed at 300 feet cost a lot more than the 20 minutes it took to check it properly. Rain was coming in sideways off the North Sea, hard enough to sting through her rain gear, and the deck lighting threw everything into these long orange shadows that made the whole platform look like the inside of a machine that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to keep running. Her boots kept slipping a little on the wet steel grating, and she had to plant each step deliberately, headlamp beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the rain while everything past 10 feet just disappeared into black. She worked her way past the crane housing, checked the first 2 junction boxes without finding anything worth noting, and stopped for a second by the moonpool cover to let a particularly hard gust pass before it could shove her sideways into the rail. The whole platform smelled like diesel exhaust and hot metal and salt. That particular offshore combination that got into a person's clothes so deep it never fully washed out even back on land. And somewhere below her, the generator bank kept up its steady mechanical hum, a sound so constant she'd stopped hearing it as noise years ago and started hearing it more like a heartbeat. The whole rig ran on. She passed the deck decompression chamber the way she did every night on this stretch of the walk, a squat steel cylinder bolted to the deck with a single round viewing port set into the door. And she almost didn't look this time, because the rain had her hood pulled low, but something made her glance sideways anyway. Reed Calloway was sitting inside on a thin gray mattress in a set of gray sweatpants, 19 days into a 28-day saturation rotation, living at depth pressure between bell runs, and even through the small round window, she could see he had that stillness some men get when they've spent too many years being alone with their own thoughts on purpose. He was 34, a commercial saturation diver who'd been living 28 days at a stretch inside pressurized steel for going on 11 years now. Long enough that his body had stopped fighting the routine of it, breathing a helium-oxygen mix that kept him adapted to working 300 feet down without his blood turning to foam when the rotation finally ended, and they decompress him over 5 or 6 days in one long, controlled ascent. What actually stopped her was the BIBS mass supply line, the thick braided hose feeding his built-in breathing system from the chamber's gas manifold through the bulkhead fitting. And under her headlamp, she could see 3 or 4 strands of the outer nylon braid had worn through near the flange seal, exposed just enough that a hard tug or a pressure spike could turn a small problem into the kind of problem that ended careers. She crouched down for a closer look, ran her thumb near the fraying without touching it, tracing the line of worn strands back to where they started. And the damage pattern told her this wasn't sudden. This was months of the hose rubbing against the same edge of the flange every time the platform rolled in a swell. She'd been trained to treat fraying like that as a rupture risk regardless of how deep in a rotation anybody was. So she pulled her tablet out from under her jacket and started typing up the incident number before the rain could short it out. Reed saw the tablet light through the glass and was up off the mattress before she'd finished the second line. Moving with the kind of controlled slowness divers get used to after enough hours breathing gas that isn't quite air. The chamber had an intercom system bolted to the bulkhead beside the viewing port, helium unscrambler crackling with static even when nobody was using it. But Reed didn't reach for the handset. He grabbed the dry erase board bolted to the inside wall instead and wrote across it in thick block letters before pressing it flat against the glass. And his first message to her read, "Do not submit that. The manager will pull the chamber for an extended maintenance hold and we'll be stuck in here 2 extra weeks. Walk away." Cora looked at the board, looked at the frayed strands still lit up under her headlamp, and didn't move an inch. She flipped her clipboard over, uncapped the grease pencil clipped to it, and wrote her own answer in letters just as blunt as his, then held it flat against the glass so he'd have no trouble reading it through the rain running down the outside. "Nylon fraying at a flange point is a Class 2 rupture hazard. I don't negotiate with steel pressure." He stared at her through that little round window for a long moment, jaw set, eyes narrowed down to something sharp and stubborn. A man who clearly wasn't used to somebody looking straight through his warning and doing the job anyway. And for a second, Cora almost expected him to bang on the glass or throw something, but he just kept staring, like he was trying to work out whether she was being difficult on purpose or whether she actually meant every word of it. He wrote something else, faster this time, letters slanting and a little harder to read. 2 weeks of lost wages so you can check a box. Cora didn't bother writing back to that one, just tapped her own board twice with the pencil right over the words steel pressure, like that was the whole argument and she wasn't interested in having it twice. He erased the board with the heel of his hand, fast and hard enough that she could hear the squeak of it through the glass, and wrote one more line, smaller this time like some of the fight had gone out of it. "You don't even know what 2 extra weeks in here does to a person." Cora read it twice, and for a second something in her wanted to write back that she had a pretty good idea what it cost to lose weeks you couldn't afford to lose. But she caught herself before the pencil touched the board, because that wasn't a conversation she had with strangers. Not even ones locked behind glass with nowhere to walk it off. She didn't owe him an explanation, and she wasn't in the business of handing one out for free, so she capped her pencil, tucked the tablet back against her chest to keep it dry, and walked on down the wet deck to finish the rest of the audit, leaving him standing at the glass in his gray sweatpants with nothing left to do about it but watch her go. She could feel him watching through the next 3 cable runs, all the way until the walkway curved past the crane housing and put steel between them, and she told herself the stiffness in her fingers was just the cold. She finished the last 2 junction boxes on autopilot, logging clean readings on both, and by the time she reached the stairwell down to the accommodation block, her hands had gone stiff enough that she fumbled the door handle twice before it caught. By the time she got back to the control room, her hands were half frozen and the incident report was already logged and time-stamped. No way to pull it back even if she'd wanted to, and she told herself that was the end of it. Some diver was annoyed at her for doing her job correctly, and in 4 days he'd be topside and off the platform on the next crew change, and she'd never think about him again. She hung her wet gear on the hook by the door and sat back down in front of her monitors, the seismic feed scrolling green lines across a black screen, the generator hum settling back into its usual place under her skin, and she poured herself coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the burner since her shift started, bitter and scorched and lukewarm all at once, and drank it anyway because getting up to make a fresh pot felt like more effort than the taste was worth. She almost believed herself right up until she caught herself checking the chamber feed camera in the corner of her display, watching without meaning to whether the man behind the glass was still standing there, or whether he'd finally sat back down and picked up his own version of a grudge to carry through the rest of his rotation. And on the little grainy black and white feed, she could just make out Reed sitting back down on the mattress, staring at the whiteboard like it had said something he hadn't finished arguing with yet. 4 days later, the chamber maintenance hold cleared, and Reed Calloway went back down on the next scheduled bell run. And somewhere between the warning on the whiteboard and the moment he climbed back into a thermal suit, he and Cora Ashby had built something neither one of them had a name for yet. Something made entirely out of dry erase marker, and the kind of silence that only makes sense to two people who've decided talking is overrated. This is the part where it stopped being an argument and started being the only reason either of them looked forward to their shift. It started because Cora came back the next night, same time, same stretch of wet deck, telling herself it was just part of the audit route and had nothing to do with the man behind the glass. And Reed was already sitting up when her headlamp swung across the viewing port like he'd been listening for her boots on the grating. He didn't write anything angry this time, just held up the whiteboard with a single word on it, "Sorry," and underneath it in smaller letters, "Bad night, not your fault." Cora looked at that for a second longer than she meant to, then wrote back on her own board, "Frayings logged and flagged. Manager already signed the extended hold." Reed's shoulders dropped about an inch, and he wrote, "Guess that's that then." And she nodded once through the glass and kept walking. But the next night she came back again, and the night after that, and by the third night neither one of them pretended it was about the audit anymore. Midnight became the time that mattered, whether she was technically due on that stretch of deck or not, and she started bringing her telemetry printouts down to the terminal, bolted outside his chamber instead of reading them at her desk. Because it turned out explaining a seismic reading to somebody who couldn't talk back forced her to actually think about what the numbers meant instead of just logging them. She drew him a rough sketch of the sensor array layout on her clipboard one night, showing him where the bioluminescence sometimes lit up the deep water cameras like somebody had scattered stars across the ocean floor. And he wrote back a description of what 300 feet actually looked like from inside a dive helmet, ink black except for his own headlamp beam, and the occasional flash of something alive that didn't want to be seen. A kind of quiet Cora had never once experienced in her life and found herself thinking about at odd hours. The acts of service started small and stayed practical, because neither one of them was the type to make a production out of kindness. Cora's workstation heater blew a fuse during a cold snap, and the maintenance crew couldn't get to it until the next crew change. And 2 nights into shivering through her shift with a space blanket over her shoulders, she noticed the air near the outer bulkhead had gone strangely warm. And when she checked the equipment log, she found Reed had gotten the chamber's environmental technician to reroute a section of the life support system's excess heat exchanger output through a shared vent line, warming the whole alcove by a good 10 degrees without anybody topside having to fill out a maintenance request. She never thanked him out loud because there wasn't a way to, but the next night she brought her clipboard down with a note already written on it before he could say anything. Chamber crew mentioned the vent trick, appreciated. Reed read it, then wrote back, "Don't get used to it, one-time offer," which they both knew wasn't true. She paid it back the only way she could, calling down to the galley and asking Dwayne to swap Reed's pressurized food lock delivery from the standard frozen ration trays to something made fresh. And the cook, who'd apparently decided Cora asking a favor for anybody was newsworthy enough to act on immediately, started sending down actual hand-baked bread through the transfer lock along with the usual protein and vegetables, still warm enough some nights that Reed could smell it before the lock even finished equalizing pressure. He wrote her a note about it that read, "First real bread in 11 years of doing this job. Don't know what to do with that information." And Cora wrote back, "Eat it before it goes stale. That's what you do with it." And for the first time since she'd started this rotation, she caught herself smiling at a whiteboard in the middle of a rainstorm like it was the most normal thing in the world. They started keeping a running list of things they'd never admit to anybody topside, her handwriting cramped and efficient, his slanted and heavy from years of writing in a marker instead of a pen. And somewhere in that list was the fact that Cora had stopped eating dinner in the mess hall entirely and started eating it, standing at his terminal instead. And the fact that Reed had started volunteering for the longer bottom time shifts on purpose, even when rotating to shorter bell runs, would have given him more rest days in the chamber. Because the longer jobs meant Cora stayed on station monitoring dive telemetry through the full shift, which gave them more hours with her lamplight sweeping past his viewport. And neither one of them ever wrote that reason down where the other could read it. On the seventh night, Reed wrote his phone number across the whiteboard, just the digits, no explanation, and held it there long enough for Cora to pull out her own phone and save it under his first name only. The next night she wrote hers back, same way, 10 numbers and nothing else. And neither of them acknowledged out loud what it meant to have a way to reach each other once the chamber door finally opened and the rotation ended. But Reed folded a scrap of paper with her number on it into his wallet anyway. And Cora didn't delete the contact even when she told herself 3 times she was going to. 9 days into knowing each other in the only way the job allowed, Reed went back down for a wellhead repair job 300 feet under the platform, working out of the diving bell with a standby diver ready to follow if anything went sideways. And Cora was 3 hours into her shift in the control room when the seabed telemetry threw up a reading that made her set her coffee down without drinking it. A section of the wellhead structure had shifted under a small underwater landslide. Nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough to pin Reed's umbilical against a steel support frame, hard enough that the automatic flow sensors registered a restriction and did exactly what they were built to do, which was shut the hot water pump down before pressure could build and blow a fitting. The problem was that shutting the pump down also meant Reed's thermal suit stopped getting the steady flow of heated water it needed to keep him functional in 34-degree water. And Cora watched his suit temperature readout start dropping on her monitor in real time, first slow, then faster, crossing from the green zone into the yellow inside of 90 seconds. She keyed the comms and got Reed's voice back distorted and thin through the heliox mix, still steady, still working the problem from his end, telling her the line was pinned and he couldn't clear it himself without cutting his own umbilical loose from something he needed. The safety system had locked the pump out entirely as a precaution against a full rupture. And clearing that lock meant a manual bypass at the topside control panel, a procedure that carried its own risk of blowing the pump seal if the pressure wasn't fed back in at exactly the right rate by exactly the right hand. Cora's station was cross-trained for dive support emergencies when the primary supervisor was off shift, and she didn't wait for the backup to wake and climb 3 decks, because she'd run this exact bypass sequence in quarterly drills and knew the procedure cold even though she'd never once had to run it with a man's life on the other end of the readout. She got up out of her chair, crossed to the dive support panel, and flipped the manual override on the safety interlock, then brought the hot water pump back online in quarter-turn increments, one hand on the flow valve and the other riding the pressure gauge, feeding heat back into Reed's suit slow enough that the system wouldn't spike and blow the coupling. For 12 minutes, she worked that panel, adjusting flow when his core temp steadied, backing off when the line pressure climbed, every movement deliberate because one wrong quarter turn could flood his suit with scalding water or drop him back into full hypothermia. Her eyes locked on 2 gauges at once, temperature and pressure, while somewhere 300 feet below her, a man she'd known for 9 days stayed alive entirely because of how precisely she could read those numbers and adjust faster than the cold could pull him under. The standby diver reached him at the 11-minute mark and got the umbilical freed from the wreckage. And by the time the bell winched back up to the platform, Reed's core temperature had stabilized enough that the medic cleared him without a trip to the mainland. But Cora didn't find that out until almost 20 minutes later, because the second she stepped back from the dive support panel, her legs stopped working properly, and she had to sit down hard on the floor of the control room. Her right hand still cramped from working the flow valve in quarter-turn increments for 12 straight minutes, her fingers hitting 3 wrong keys in a row when she tried to log the incident report, until she gave up and just sat there on the cold floor tiles, listening to her own breathing even out. She didn't go down to see him that night or the next morning, because every time she thought about walking down to the chamber, she saw the readout dropping instead, the exact number where his suit had crossed into hypothermia territory, and something in her that had held steady through 3 years of storms and equipment failures and a father's boat going down in a squall finally hit a wall it couldn't climb over. She put in her resignation 2 days later, cited personal reasons on the form because there wasn't a box for what actually happened, packed her gear in under an hour, and sent Reed a single text from the crew boat on the way back to Aberdeen, the only message she ever sent him that didn't come through a whiteboard, and it took her 4 attempts to get the words right. "I can't do this, Reed. I spent 12 minutes watching your suit temperature cross into hypothermia range, knowing my hand on that valve was the only thing standing between you and freezing down there. I can't live under that kind of pressure again. Please just let me go. I need the quiet." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, blocked his number and her rig email before the boat even docked, and didn't turn her phone back on for 3 days. Reed read that message 2 days later, standing outside the decompression chamber on his last day of blowdown, still breathing mixed gas but cleared to check his phone through the medical lock, and he read it twice all the way through without saying a word to the empty chamber around him. 3 weeks after that, Cora was stocking shelves in a marine salvage warehouse outside of Fishing Town in Maine, cataloging rusted anchors and old brass fittings for a fraction of her offshore pay, because at least nothing in that warehouse could die if her hand slipped. He didn't type out a long response, didn't call, didn't send anything back at all. Because he learned a long time ago that some things a person needed to hear in person or not at all, and this was clearly the first kind. He looked at the dive bag still sitting in his passenger seat, looked at his truck keys in the ignition, and made the kind of decision a man makes when he's spent 11 years learning that the only thing worth trusting is what he can build with his own 2 hands. It took Reed Calloway 3 days of calling every marine salvage outfit listed between Portland and Bar Harbor before a gravel voice man named Wallace admitted he had somebody new working inventory who matched the description: 2 flights and a missed connection across the Atlantic, a 5-hour drive up the Maine coast in a rental truck he'd never driven before, and 11 years of never once asking anybody for anything to finally walk through a warehouse door, carrying something wrapped careful in a moving blanket, and what he set down on that packing crate ended up saying more than any speech he could have written on a whiteboard. This is the part where showing up turned out to be worth a lot more than showing off. Cora had been at the salvage warehouse 3 weeks by the time the rain started coming down, steady on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of quiet gray weather that made the whole building smell like wet concrete and machine oil, and the particular rust that settles into anything that's spent decades near salt water. She'd taken the job cataloging inventory for a company that bought up decommissioned marine hardware from fishing outfits and old rig operators, mostly anchors and chain and fittings, too specialized for anybody but a handful of buyers to want. And she liked it well enough because nothing on these shelves needed her to work a valve in quarter turns or watch a number on a screen and hope it went the right direction. She was up on a wooden step ladder that afternoon, tagging a row of galvanized anchors with a marker that smelled like paint thinner, telling herself for the 4th or 5th time that week that a quiet job in a quiet town was exactly the trade she'd wanted to make. The warehouse owner, a retired trawler captain named Wallace, who ran the place with 1 part-time employee and a dog that slept in the forklift bay, had stopped asking Cora questions about her offshore work about a week in, mostly because every time he tried, she found something urgent to do with the inventory spreadsheet. And by the 3rd week, he'd settled into just handing her the clipboard each morning and letting her work in whatever silence she needed. She'd taken to eating her lunch alone on an overturned bucket near the loading bay, watching the rain run down the corrugated tin roof in long silver streaks, telling herself the ache behind her sternum some mornings was just the damp Maine cold getting into her joints and not anything worth naming. The warehouse door was the old rolling kind, steel track and a chain pull, and it made a sound like a freight train whenever anybody worked it, which was why Cora heard Reed coming a full 10 seconds before she saw him. And by the time she turned around on the ladder, he was already 3 steps inside with rain still dripping off his canvas work coat onto the concrete floor. He hadn't shaved in a few days, hadn't bothered changing out of the same coat he probably wore on job sites, and he wasn't carrying flowers or a folder of paperwork or anything that looked planned. Just something wrapped in a moving blanket and cradled against his chest with both arms, like it weighed more than it looked like it should. Wallace stuck his head out of the little glassed-in office at the sound of the door, took one look at the size of Reed and the state of Cora's face, and quietly pulled the office door shut again without a word, which was about the most tactful thing the old captain had done in the 3 weeks Cora had known him. He walked straight down the center aisle without saying anything yet, boots leaving wet prints on the concrete, and Cora came down off the ladder rung by rung because her hands had started shaking too badly to trust them on the higher steps. And by the time her feet hit the floor, Reed had already set the bundle down on the nearest empty packing crate and was pulling the moving blanket away from it. Underneath was a diving helmet, an old one, the heavy brass and copper kind divers used to wear back before anybody had invented the lightweight gear, polished until it caught what little light came through the warehouse skylights. And behind the thick glass faceplate, somebody had built a small planted garden inside the dome, moss and 2 or 3 little ferns rooted in a shallow bed of soil, green and alive and completely out of place against 70 years of brass. "Reed," Cora said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "What are you doing here? I told you in that text exactly what I needed." "I read it," Reed said, and he didn't move any closer, just stood there with his hands resting on either side of the helmet like he needed something solid to hold on to while he talked. "I read it about 6 times before I got on a plane. I'm not here to ask you back to the rigs, and I'm not here to tell you the pump lock was your fault, because it wasn't, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it won't ever happen again either, because that'd be a lie and you'd see right through it in about 2 seconds. Cora looked at the helmet instead of at him, because looking at him directly felt like more than she could manage right then, and she asked the only question that made any sense to her. "Where did you even find this?" "Salvage yard outside Peterhead," Reed said. "Navy surplus, Mark V, been sitting in a bin for God knows how long before somebody thought to clean it up. Took me about a week of nights to get the brass right and figure out how to keep something alive in there without drowning the roots." He tapped the copper dome once with 2 fingers, the same short, definite motion he used on a valve he was checking. "It survived 70 years down at the bottom of whatever it survived. Now it just holds a garden. I figured that was worth showing you before I said anything else." Cora put her hand flat against the copper the way he tapped it, felt the cold of it against her palm, the metal not giving an inch the way it hadn't given an inch for the better part of a century, and something about the weight of it under her fingers made it easier to keep her voice steady than looking at Reed's face had been. "I froze up, Reed. After. My hands wouldn't work right for 2 days. "You didn't freeze," Reed said, flat, like he wasn't interested in arguing the point twice. "You worked a dive support panel for 12 minutes with a man's core temperature dropping on the other end of it, adjusting flow and pressure in quarter turns while reading 2 gauges at once. And you got the numbers right the whole way through. And then afterward, your body did what bodies do once the job's finished, and there's nobody left to hold steady for. That's not the same thing as freezing up. I've seen guys freeze up. That's not what you did." Cora's eyes stayed on the moss growing inside the helmet, tiny and green and stubbornly rooted in a place that had no business growing anything at all. And she thought about 3 years offshore and a father's boat going down in a squall, and a whole life built around never once needing anybody to catch her if she slipped, and something in that careful architecture finally gave way. Not with a crash, just a quiet settling, like a structure deciding it had been holding its own weight alone for long enough. She stepped forward before she'd fully decided to, and Reed's arms came up around her the same steady way his hands had worked that valve. No rush to it, no performance in it, Just two people who'd already proven to each other exactly what they were capable of holding. 10 months later, on a clear, cold afternoon in October, Cora and Reed stood on a stretch of rocky Maine coastline under the shadow of a lighthouse the Coast Guard had decommissioned decades back. Wildflowers cut that morning, sitting in mason jars along a row of folding chairs, and a guest list small enough to count on two hands. Mostly former platform crew who'd flown in from 3 different countries, and a handful of dock workers from the town Cora had landed in by accident. Wallace gave her away, walking her across the uneven rock with one hand steady under her elbow and muttering something about how he'd known plenty of divers in his time, and none of them had ever looked at a woman the way Reed looked at her, which was as close to a blessing as the old captain seemed capable of giving. Cora wore a plain ivory dress with no train to speak of, practical enough to walk the uneven ground without tripping, and Reed stood waiting for her in a pressed shirt that still somehow looked like it belonged on a worksite. Their vows ran short and plain, the way both of them talked when it mattered. Reed saying he'd learned more about trust from a woman working a dive panel in quarter turns than he ever had from anybody who talked a big game. And Cora saying she'd learned that the strongest thing a person could build wasn't a wall, it was a habit of showing up. When they turned to walk back down the rocky path as husband and wife, their old crew formed two loose lines along the way. Canvas jackets zipped against the wind, and one by one they lifted their battered steel coffee thermoses and tapped them twice against the folding chairs. A short metallic ring that carried out over the waves each time. Not a cheer exactly, just the sound a crew makes when they're marking something the only way they know how. 8 months after the wedding, on an ordinary evening with the tide going out, Cora sat on the porch steps of the narrow cedar-sided house they'd bought 2 miles up the coast, a fixer-upper with good bones and a decade of deferred maintenance they were working through on weekends, and she was going through a crate of old salvage ledgers by lamplight because neither of them had much interest in sitting still for long. Reed came out from the workshop he'd been running for the past 4 months, rebuilding marine pumps and compressor systems for the local fishing fleet, carrying 2 dented enamel camp mugs of tea, handed her one without a word, and sat down on the step below her, with his sleeves pushed up past his elbows and grease still dark under 2 fingernails, and neither one of them felt any particular need to fill the quiet with talking, because filling silence had never really been how the two of them worked. Through the window behind them, the brass helmet sat where it lived now, on the sill catching the last of the evening light. Its little garden a shade fuller than it had been at the wedding, one new fern frond Cora had planted herself the week before, curling up against 70-year-old copper the way something new sometimes finds room to grow inside, something that already proved it could survive. On the shelf beside it sat the same grease pencil she'd once used to write him a warning through 3 inches of chamber glass, kept now for nothing more practical than the fact that neither of them had ever gotten around to throwing it away. Reed reached over and tapped his mug against hers once, the same short, definite motion the crew had used with their thermoses outside the lighthouse, and neither of them said a single word about what it meant, because by now they didn't have to.